Good morning. I'm David Burton, Senior Fellow in Economic Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. Our subject today is it humane to be a socialist? A highly relevant subject it is. Today's event is the fifth in a speaker series we call Free Markets, the Ethical Economic Choice. And it provides a moral and ethical critique of socialism and makes the case for the moral superiority of a free economy. I want to bring to your attention the next two events in this series. On November 15th, George Gilder of the Discovery Institute will give a talk called Capitalism is an Information and Learning System. And on November 30th, Mike Munger of Duke University will give a talk, If Poverty is the Real Problem, then Capitalism is the Only Solution. I would also like to bring to your attention an event that's not part of this series, but may be of interest to you. On November 16th, Gregory May will be here to talk about his new book, Jefferson's Treasure, How Albert Gallatin Saved the New Nation from Debt. Now, Gallatin, I think, is a seriously underestimated figure. He cut taxes, reduced the national debt by half, reformed government finances. He was sort of a one-man OMB, and funded both the Louisiana Purchase and the War of 1812. He was both Jefferson's and Madison's Secretary of the Treasury and their answer to Alexander Hamilton. And it's his statue that stands at the front of the Treasury building. On to today's event. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Deirdre Mccloskey. She is among the most erudite defenders of classical liberalism and a free economy in the United States today. Since the year 2000, Dr. Mccloskey has been the Distinguished Professor of Economics, History, English, and Communications at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Trained at Harvard, which we won't hold against you, as an economist. She's written 16 books and edited 7 more and published some 360 articles on economic theory, economic history, philosophy, rhetoric, feminism, ethics, and the law. Dr. Mccloskey had the challenging task of teaching me price theory while a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. That was my good fortune. She was also a professor of economics and history at the University of Iowa. Dr. Mccloskey's many books are unusually well written, particularly when it comes to economics, which, as she's written, isn't always a discipline that has the very finest writing, although lawyers do pretty bad too. Anyway, spending time with these books is always both deeply edifying and a genuine pleasure. And I want to bring a few to your attention. First, the Bourgeois Era Trilogy, 3 books written over a period of about 10 years. The most recent is Bourgeois Equality, How Ideas, Not Capital or Institutions, Enrich the World. Then Bourgeois Dignity, Why Economics Can't Explain the Modern World. And the first, Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce, written in 2006. Now, these books argue that new ideas are the explanation for the great enrichment from 1800 to the present. Liberty and dignity for ordinary people, classical liberalism, led to an explosion of what she calls trade-tested betterment. She argues that materialist explanations, such as capital accumulation or exploitation, are mistaken. In a modern restatement of ideas explored originally by Adam Smith in his theory of moral sentiment, she also makes the case that a virtue ethics, celebrating bourgeois or middle-class virtues, is sound and central to our society's success. Other books that you might find of value: The Cult of Statistical Significance, How the Standard Era Cost Us Jobs, Justice, and Lives, written with Stephen Zillick. The Rhetoric of Economics, Knowledge and Persuasion in Economics, If You're So Smart, The Narrative of Economic Expertise, Second Thoughts, Myths and Morals of U.S. Economic History. And last but not least, The Applied Theory of Price. We used the Applied Theory of Price in mimeoform while I was at Chicago. It's now available online for free at www.deirdremccloskey.com for those who would like a good price theory book. And if you haven't read a price theory book, you should. The core analytical power of economics, in my judgment, is price theory. Now, after her presentation, we'll have time for audience Q&A, and a copy of her remarks or at least an outline, perhaps is a better term, will be available to anyone who wants it after the event. Please join me in welcoming Deirdre Mccloskey.
Thank you very much. I have a speech defect, which you'll have to grow accustomed to or run screaming from the room. It's still a free country, even after yesterday's election. I had to make a joke about the election at this institute. That price theory book that you speak of, I intend to do a third edition of.
Okay.
When I get the time from the other things I want to do. And among the things I want to do, and is one of the core ideas in the trilogy that David mentioned, is to undermine the attractions of socialism. Now, socialism is attractive. The title of my talk is Socialism is Ethical at Age 16, Not at 26 or my own age, 76. And when I was 16, as the child of a Harvard professor, therefore upper middle class by birth, I was a socialist, so to speak, somewhat unscholarly one. It was the age of folk music, so I call myself a Joan Baez socialist. I dreamt I saw Joe Hill. The old joke is that someone who's not a socialist by age 16 has no heart. Someone who's still a socialist at age 26 has no brain. Now, at age 16, with the background that I had, socialism looked, and you could say was, ethically defensible. If you grow up in a family, and I take it everyone here did, you grow up in a socialist enterprise. The mom in the old traditional family, which is thankfully slowly declining, was the central planner, and indeed had her own little homework factory. My grandmother could make all the girls' clothing, could cook for 40 hours a week, everything from scratch. So there was economic production in the home that she did, and then her husband went off to be an electrician and then an electrical contractor. And the people in such a house, and certainly in mine, where my father would go off to the office and do God knows what, and then come home, and income would fall like manna on the household. That background makes for socialists. I mean, it's still more for people like me who haven't done honest work in her entire life. I've been in academic life. I was good at school, so I stayed. And if you go to college and live in a dorm, as I did, and then go to graduate school and live in a dorm, as I did, and then get married, and then you have a central planner to take care of you, and then you, particularly if your field is English or history, as mine sometimes is, you're going to emerge at age, 27 or something, as someone who's always lived in families. And you're going to view the market as this very strange, foreign intrusion on the idyllic scene of from each according to her ability, to each according to her need. Now, of course, if you grow up on a farm, as very, very few Americans do now, 1800, over 80% of Americans were on farms. Now it's about 1%. Then you know where meat comes from. And you know, as we say, the value of money. You know that your parents worry about the price of hogs or soybeans. So, or if you grow up, as some of you surely did, over the shop, so to speak, with a small business on the ground floor, an apartment upstairs where the family lived, and you worked as a child in the family, or if when you were a child you had a paper route or something like that, there's variation, it turns out, in the organization of paper routes I learned the other day, and some of them are more entrepreneurial than others. Depends on the size of the newspaper. So it's no wonder, considering that those occupations, those families are declining in weight in the American economy, and most particularly agriculture. It's quite enormous, that socialism survives in people's minds, young people's minds especially. I mean, David and I were speaking earlier about how strange it is that on TV you see these kids being interviewed, and they say earnestly, and they're not bad people, they're just saying earnestly, I think we ought to try socialism, as though socialism hasn't ever been tried. Let's change the system, people are always saying, which is my own experience with changing the system is that it doesn't work. One version of the golden rule is those who have the gold rule under whichever whatever system we have. Now, it seems to me, I wonder if you agree, that one's political convictions tend to freeze sometime in one's 20s. And most people acquire their politics in their early 20s and then don't ever change. Saul Bellow remarked once that as a youthful adolescent Trotskyist, he was more scholarly than I was about my Trotskyism, he found it very hard to shift, as he gradually did, to be some sort of conservative. Now, so far as the ethical question's concerned that we're dealing with here, of course, the age of reason, in the age of reason, in each of us, in each of our lives, we're supposed to use reason. And it's decidedly unethical not to, in thinking about the politics that we're going to impose on our neighbors. And it's striking in my experience, being once a socialist, now a free market advocate. I call myself a humane libertarian, or a bleeding heart libertarian, or a Christian liberal. It's striking that my socialist friends, of whom I have a great many, resist reason. Resist the reasonable claims that this book that David plans to come out of these speeches have the claims of reason against socialism. They're the claims of sheer experience, that would be historical reasoning. The people who advocate socialism now, I'm fond of saying that Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, both of whom are about my age, we shared the same views in 1960, but they didn't change since then. You hear speeches by Bernie Sanders, and they sound like 1960s socialist speeches. And it's striking that they haven't learned from history at all. Jeremy Corbyn and my friend, the economist Joe Stiglitz, praised Chavez and now Maduro in Venezuela. In the coverage of the Venezuelan catastrophe, it's quite notable that the journalists, again, I'm sure innocently, this isn't a conspiracy, they're not bad in that simple-minded sense, cover it as though it were a natural disaster, as though a hurricane had hit Venezuela, and for some reason you couldn't get any food or medicine at the store, and for some reason you had to take wheelbarrows full of money to buy bread. If these socialist friends of mine, they're Marxists, and most of them are. In fact, most of us, in a way, since the 1890s, have been at least Marxoid. I've noticed resistance to my 3 wonderful books, which are available on Amazon.com cheap and even in spoken books, so what are you waiting for? Have a Marxoid theory of history, which is that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. When I read that in the Communist Manifesto as a kid, I thought, great, now I don't need to read anything more, because now I have the formula, somewhat like the formula in economics of marginal cost equal marginal benefit. But if they're so we're all, in a sense, for about 100 years, we've all been uninterested, or not, that isn't the word. We're unpersuaded by the force of ideas, the independent force of ideas. And what's strange about this fact of intellectual history, especially in the West, is that the people saying, oh, ideas don't matter, all that matters is interest. My former colleague, George Stigler at the University of Chicago, is among this, and Murray Rothbard, another acquaintance of mine. And I called them both America's leading vulgar Marxists, because they talk this way all the time, that it's interest that determines ideas, when they themselves were purveyors of ideas. They themselves were making speeches just like the one I'm making now. So there's something strangely inconsistent about this materialist proposition. But my Marxist friends, to get back to that sentence, they walk by the evidence, the evidence of reason, the historical evidence, the economic evidence. I think one reason for this is that the progressives, to cover them all, assume that people, like most of the people in this room, are evil. Look to your left, look to your right. There is an evil person there. Which means that you don't need to pay attention to what they say. Why pay attention to Hitler? Come on. An extreme case of this is the egregious Professor Nancy McLean of Duke University. It's written an astoundingly ignorant book about James Buchanan, a great liberal economist, attaching him through no good reason. No, she didn't interview anyone to do this. She just wants to do it with Calhoun's theories of racism. Or a Charles Koch, for whom I have worked. So I'm the enemy. She has a rule, actually, which she articulated this year, which is that Nancy will not, she's a historian, she's in the history department, Nancy will not speak to anyone who's accepted Koch money. And indeed, she won't speak to anyone from any university which has accepted money from Charles Koch. Now, the problem with this is that Duke University has accepted considerable amounts of money from Charles Koch, so Nancy can't speak to herself, which perhaps explains why her book is so shockingly bad. We libertarians and conservatives, by contrast, I speak at least for the libertarians, such as Don Boudreau, George Mason, or Tom Palmer across town at Cato, or for that matter for Charles Koch, assume that the progressives who say socialism, yeah, we ought to try that, are just misinformed. And that if we teach them that the tariffs are idiotic, as they certainly are, or that stopping people from starting businesses is a bad idea, they'll say, "Oh yeah, you're right. I hadn't thought of that. You're right." Surely, but they don't. Now, what's the evidence against socialism that people at the age of reason should be listening to, but don't? After they've put away their natural and childish emotional toys of socialism. But by the way, that hypothesis of mine, that argument I made a few minutes ago about the family you're raised in, is a highly, highly testable proposition. It's a piece of sociology that I wish some sociologists would find out about. I've argued in the trilogy that David mentioned that the rise of income per head in the countries that have adopted what you can properly call historically liberalism, free markets and free minds, has since 1800 increased, now hear this, by 3,000%. That's income per head. And indeed, it can be income of the poorest. As you know, there's a lot of anxiety these days about inequality. It's become part of the Kant, not Immanuel Kant, but the Kant on TV. But in fact, it was the poor who benefited the most from this gigantic increase in income. If you ask people, even quite well-informed people, even employees of the World Bank sometimes, as the great Hans Rosling, R-O-S-L-I-N-G, Hans Rosling, you really must go find his videos did. He would ask people, how much do you think income has increased since 1800 in Finland or Japan or the United States? And even well-informed people would say, well, I don't know, 100% maybe 200%. But it's all gone to the rich. The poor people haven't benefited. Even though the poor people went in 1800 from having nada to having large apartments, air conditioning, refrigerators, which most Americans didn't have, and as recently as certainly 100 years ago, they had ice boxes if they were well-to-do, automobiles, etc., etc. Excellent health care by the comparisons of 1900, when going to the doctor was very dangerous. So they think, oh, it's 100% or 200%. No, it's not. It's a factor of 30. I had the embarrassing task at a speech I gave on this, more or less the same subject about 2 weeks ago in Cambridge, England, to an audience of all people, anthropologists, of explaining to a very eminent anthropologist, I won't give his name, it's embarrassing, who stood up afterwards and said, I agree with your claim that it's a factor of 30 since olden days. He's a very eminent historical anthropologist. But this 3,000% is wrong. And I didn't say, oh, professor, 30 minus 1 divided by 1 is 29, multiplied by 100 to get it percentage, and you've got 2,900, which is roughly 3,000. I couldn't do it. I said, oh, yeah, I see what you mean. Oh, yeah, good point. But that fact is extremely important to acquire, as John Dewey used to say, on your pulse. You should really get this into your head and your heart and grasp that free markets have increased income per head by 3,000%. And bid fair to do it for the entire world. There's no racial or cultural reason why sub-Saharan Africa can't be as rich as the United States. And as indeed the cases of China and India show very plainly. When I was young, when I was a beginning student of economics, I was told by my teachers, my distinguished teachers at Harvard, that things were hopeless in China because, they're all Confucians. What can you do as a Confucian? And in India, the problem is they're all Hindus or maybe Muslims, which is maybe worse. It's hopeless. They've a caste system, and they're just, India and China aren't ever going to grow. And then in 1978, at least in the economy, the Chinese government started to introduce liberalism. And in India, thank God, in 1991, the world's largest democracy, they started to do the same thing. And since then, rates of growth have been from 5 to 10% per year per capita. Whereas under Mao, they were essentially 0% per capita. Under what the Indians call the license Raj, under Nehru and the Gandhis, was 1%, in a good year 2%. 5% per year, 5 or 6% per year solves a lot of social problems, and is since 1991 in India. Now, the argument from our progressive friends, and I keep saying I use that phrase not in contempt, but because I do have progressive friends, and I do talk to them, and I do love them. They say, oh no, it was caused by the government, this rise since 1800. And it wearies me, but I then go through the arguments why wasn't caused by the government. For example, I have a very distinguished colleague in the history department at the University of Illinois, Chicago, who's a man of the left and he's a labor historian. And I once said to him casually that the 8-hour day wasn't caused by laws. It wasn't caused by struggles on the picket line or at the voting booth. It was caused, and he was startled by this assertion and didn't believe it. He was contemptuous of the very idea. Of course it was laws. It says so right in the law. No one should work more than 8 hours a day. I mean, what more do you need? You conservatives, he called me. But, of course, it's not true. We have an 8-hour-a-day law, not law, custom in the United States, because people don't want to work more than 8 hours a day. And indeed, for a long time, the standard work week froze. It went down from 12 to 10 to 8 by custom and by law. But it seemed to have frozen. But it actually continued going down because people live longer on retirement. They go to school longer. The amount of time people spend not working, I myself am retired, though I retired in order to work, is not because of laws, but because of the immensely increased productivity of the economy. Indeed, the effective welfare state, which takes quite a while to emerge, is, of course, partly because of the spread of the right to vote, but it's also, and that's the legal source, but it's also because as our economies get more rich, we feel we can, to use a non-economic word, afford a welfare state. And indeed, more generally, wages are not determined by bargaining. There's a kind of theory on the left, which I see evinced in lots of news stories and speeches by politicians, that the bosses have piles of gold in the back room, and that the job of us progressives is to extract the gold and give it to the workers. And they believe this especially firmly in France, where, one labor law after another is imposed on the French economy, on the idea that the only way the workers are going to get better off is by going after that gold. And it's not true. Wages are determined, as economists have understood since the late 19th century, by supply and demand for workers. And the amount of evidence for that is using the word overwhelming doesn't express it strongly enough. It's gigantic. Now, why did this happen? If we're going to convince our socialist friends that socialism is not the way forward, we've got to convince them that capitalism is. But one of the troubles is that the word capitalism embodies a scientific error. It's a very, very foolish word. Unfortunately, it's been dominant in economics. Not since Marx. Marx didn't ever use exactly capitalism, although he used capitalist freely, but since the late 19th century. But it suggests very strongly to both the left and the liberals and the conservatives that the modern history of the economy is about the accumulation of capital. And I have many other friends, not on the left, who still believe this. But though capital is necessary, as is the rule of law and private property for this factor of 30, this 3,000%, it's not the spring of the watch. Think of that metaphor here. The springs, I'll have to say to make it grammatical, are ideas. Ideas. The capital and the rule of law and peace and whatever are the gears, or even the clock face that shows the result of the spring and the gears, and is not itself in any sense causal. And I think we need to ponder this metaphor, because I think it's apt, and I think it focuses on what's important. What's important is a society in which ideas can flourish. As the Austrian economist, I'm something of an Austrian economist. I've been everything. I've been an Austrian. I've been a socialist. I've been a Chicago School economist. I've been a social engineer. I've been a man. I've been everything. As the Austrian economists say, these are the discoveries that the alert entrepreneur notices as she walks around. They are, as Israel Kirzner says, the massive free lunches that made up the 3,000%. The idea of electric lights, the idea of cameras. In the old days, that camera would have to be much larger than it is. The idea of projectors, the idea of nice wood maybe it's not solid, I don't know. But that depends on the bandsaw. The idea, the carpeting, this cheap, inexpensive carpeting, very attractive carpeting in the room, the steel that makes up the chairs. Those are all ideas. And indeed, the idea of a think tank, which this building embodies, is itself an idea. My absolutely favorite example is Malcolm McLean, no relation, I take it, to Nancy, who invented in 1956 containerization. You have standardized steel boxes. You've seen hundreds of them, either 20 feet long or 40 feet long, that can be stacked on top of each other and put onto ships in the number now of 10,000 40-foot containers per ship at the highest level. 10,000 40-foot containers. That's a lot of 100-car trains, and which radically reduce the cost of ocean transport for non-bulk goods. And of course, at the same time, bulk carriers, oil tankers in particular, got larger and larger and larger. No science was involved. Containerization is an organizational idea, like think tanks, or the modern university invented in Berlin in 1810, combining research and teaching. So the ideas are not necessarily mechanical or electronic or whatever, but they get tested in commerce. I keep altering that phrase that David mentioned once. I call it trade-tested betterment. Now I'm calling it simply commercially tested betterment. That's the test. The test is, does the container make money? And of course, the left views, and the socialists view the money, the profit, as just kind of a tax. Robert, is that his name? Sowell at Hoover? Robert Sowell? Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell has a brilliant passage in his wonderful elementary book on economics, where he says, well, okay, suppose profit is just a tax. It's a tax necessary, he says, and even our socialist friends would agree, to call out the enterprise that makes for containerization or the steam engine or whatever. And it's about what? 15% of national income? Maybe 20? Okay, it's about that, on that order. Whereas, let's consider socialism. The tax in socialism, let's compare East and West Germany. Take a more extreme case, South and North Korea, is 50% or more. Okay, class, which system do you want? The one with a 15 or 20% tax, or one with a 50 or 90% tax? So this commercially tested betterment made us rich and reasonably good. It didn't corrupt our souls. That's a claim that's been common in all cultures since the beginning. Since the beginning of specialization, there have been towns, that is, there have been middlemen, and the middlemen are always bad. Bankers, for example. Bad, says everyone else, while buying from them, while taking loans from them. But I in the first book of that trilogy, I argued at some length, 500 pages, if you want to know, against this idea that commercially tested betterment is just essentially corrupting. Because as a Christian, this is an important issue for me. Well, what does it matter if someone gets the earth but loses her immortal soul? And I really believe that. If I thought that, I actually started to call it innovism, which I think is a better word than capitalism, if innovism actually lost our immortal souls, I would be a socialist. I'd be up here saying, you're wrong. Socialism is great. Let's go for it. If I actually thought that socialism would do a better job for the soul, and I think the evidence there is overwhelmingly that it doesn't. That in fact, the 70 years of communism in the Soviet Union wrecked the ethics of ordinary Russians. And it's not just the high-level stuff, the containerization, although when McLean invented containerization, he didn't think it would end up with 10,000 containers on a ship. He just wanted to do a few of them. So he started small, but so did Ray Kroc start small. So did Bill Gates. Not so small, actually. But it's also the ordinary people having a go. The ordinary woman who decides to open a hairdressing salon in the neighborhood and puts her heart and soul into it. The ordinary guy who goes to the oil fields, moves to the oil fields of North Dakota in its oil boom. Where did this confidence come from? This confidence in having a go. Humans have always been innovative to some degree, but it's very striking how much more innovative they become in countries like England or France or the United States or Italy or Japan after 1800. How did this happen? Well, it came from what Adam Smith calls the obvious and simple plan, the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice, by which he meant equality of social standing, the kind of respect that all Americans accord to each other or should. Liberty to open the hairdressing salon or invent the internet, and equal justice before the law. It's an egalitarian proposition, this liberalism. And here I want to quarrel with some of you in the audience who might be traditional conservatives who don't believe in equality. I don't believe in what I call French-style equality, Rousseau's equality after the event, the cutting down of tall poppies. But I do believe in equality in these senses that Adam Smith spoke of. Equal rights to equal rights to venture, express it that way. So at age 26, and certainly by 76, you're supposed to know this kind of thing. You're supposed to know that socialism hasn't historically worked, that there are sound reasons to think that it doesn't work, even though it works in small societies. Among friends, you're dividing up a pizza. It would be obnoxious if your so-called friend said, well, I paid for the pizza. I should get most of the slices. That's friendship destroying. You wouldn't want to do that. So among friends, as Erasmus said, all things are held in common. In his great book of Latin tags, that was always the first one. But that's among friends. It's not among strangers in the Great Society. I bought a couple of years ago a little accordion, and I'm trying very slowly to learn it because I won't practice. This is a bit of a problem. You've heard the old joke, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice. How do you get to the Catskills? Stop practicing. So they ought to know that in the Great Society you can't have from each according to his ability to each according to her need. St. Paul said, he who does not work should not eat. He was complaining by correspondence that his former friends who thought that the Messiah was about to come again decided, well, why work if the Messiah is going to come tomorrow? And he said, no. The great motto of the monks from the 4th century on was laborare est orare, to work is to pray. Now, is it ethical to go on with such misapprehensions? No, of course not. It's the ethical responsibility of an adult to know what's going on. We should know it when we vote, or when we're in business, or in our marriages, or whatever. So what in brief are the ethics I approve of? Well, as explained in these books, that I think the best way to approach ethical questions is through so-called virtue ethics, which is the oldest impulse about ethical thought. It's common East and West and South. You can find pieces of it in Confucianism or Hinduism or Buddhism, in Islam, in the Abrahamic religions. And it is, there's an old joke advice about how to write well. How to write well. Be good, then write naturally. Be good and then write naturally. And I'm suggesting that the named virtues, prudence, justice, courage, temperance, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love, with their libraries of cultural products behind each of them, should be, and models for behavior, Florence Nightingale, Odysseus, etc. These should be our guides, not the abstract rules that became unsurprisingly popular in the 18th century. Abstract rules like contractarianism, a la Hobbes and Locke, or Kant, not Kant, but Kant, justice elevated to the one ethical principle, or Jeremy Bentham with prudence elevated to the one. No. As Adam Smith said, when I do this in Russia, I always do it the other way. As Adam Smith said in his greatest book, which you must read, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments in its last edition, the great guide to behavior should be the virtues arranged together. That if all you have in your heart is justice, you lack love. If all you have in your heart is love, you'll lack justice. And so I end with a summary of how these rules turn out, which is a combination of our conservative heritage and the liberal Abrahamic egalitarian promise of equal souls. Hillel of Babylon, late in the 1st century BCE, said, "Do not do unto others what you would not have them do to you." This negative form is like the libertarians, in fact it is, the libertarians' non-aggression axiom. It's masculine, so to speak. Leave me alone. Don't tread on me. I have autonomy. Whereas another Jewish sage early in the 1st century BCE, Jesus of Nazareth said, do unto others what you would have them do unto you. This positive way of saying it is, so to speak, feminine, although I don't want to make some essentialist argument here, me least of all. Be a good Samaritan. Don't cross by on the other side. Be nice. And I think we need both. I think in a socialist society, we will not have both. Reminds me of still another old joke. Someone wrote on the wall, scribbled on the wall, to do is to be, Descartes. The next person wrote, to be is to do, Kierkegaard. The third person wrote, doobie doobie doo, Sinatra. And that's about right. To do and to be the kind of person who does good. You need to live in a free and responsible society, such as I think everyone here advocates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Sit down to answer the questions, because I
there's
am.
a mic right there. We have time for some questions. We have folks that are going to go around the room with mics. Please state your name and your institutional affiliation before you ask your question, and try to keep the questions brief. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Simone Gao from Newtown Dynasty Television. I have 3 questions. First, what do you think? One by one. Right. Thank you so much. My first question, what do you think is the deepest flaw of socialism, and what's the cause of it? What's the cause of that flaw?
Well, the deepest flaw is the notion that an economy can be run from the top down. This is a point that Hayek made, and lots of other people. When, what was her name? Martha, I think her first name is Martha Hamburg, retired as the head of the Federal Drug Administration. She was interviewed on NPR, and the reporter said with apparent delight that Hamburg had been in charge of 20% of the American economy. You think, what, 20%? One person? Yep. Food and drugs. And it's a persistent error that the economy is easy. That's another of the socialist axioms. That it's easy to do. We don't need discovery. We don't need to learn if the neighborhood needs another hairdressing salon. What's the second question?
This is a follow-up for the first question. Why is this theory wrong, like top-down economy, run from the top? Why is this wrong?
Logically. It's possible that there's a world, perhaps an alternate universe, in which top-down management of the economy is fine. And indeed, as I said, in a family, that's how it's managed, top-down. The Confucian analogy of the emperor with the mandate of heaven being the father of the nation, and which is a metaphor that occurs everywhere, is the source of the problem. People believe that they can take the model of the family and apply it to the whole society. And as I said, from an ethical point of view, from the point of view of a 16-year-old who doesn't know anything, but is pretty sure she does, Sure, she knows everything. It sounds fine, but it's not. And indeed, anyone with any experience of life knows that a family can't really be governed very well. Think of your offspring, your children. Think of mine who haven't spoken to me for 22 years.
So you're just saying it's proven wrong. It's not.
No. Yeah, it's proven wrong because there's no logical proof. This is an empirical fact. That's why it comes with maturity, if it does. In the case of Bernie Sanders, it didn't, but that's okay. It comes with maturity. Or reading. If you open your mind, you think, gee whiz, things didn't work out very well in the Soviet Union. Yeah, but even that in ultimately is empirical. And indeed, that's how the socialists in the socialist calculation debate of the 1920s and 30s took it. They took it as a challenge to get more computers, to get smarter and smarter people at the center. And then we could, everything would be fine. I have a friend, a colleague of mine in Iowa, who was asked to go to one of the Soviet republics to advise them on transport of agricultural goods. And, he's from Iowa. They figured he could tell them about that. So he did. He said, look, we have trucks and grain elevators and ships and barges and so forth. And then someone in the audience said, but who's the commissar? Who's in charge? And Gary said, no one's in charge. And they stopped believing him. They thought he was hiding a state secret. What's the third one? Then we'll go on.
Oh, okay.
He had his hand up early, this guy did. I go for eager beavers.
I'm Pat Mackler, and I work for Senator Ron Johnson. You use the term innovism.
Yeah.
And I wonder this. To what extent is the charm of socialism a feeling by people that somehow they could be protected from somebody else who's going to disrupt them with some innovative idea?
That's absolutely true. And it's evident it was evident yesterday. And in the appeal of this is something that Bernie Sanders and Trump, of course, agree on, protectionism. And I understand that the disturbances of new industries, of what was terrifyingly called creative destruction, it's not Schumpeter's phrase, but he borrowed it from someone else, comes from progress, not from neoliberalism or sneaky Chinese who are trying to sell us hammers inexpensively or something like that, or Mexicans and auto parts. It's very irritating that they do that. It doesn't come from those. It comes from progress. Now hear this. Speak of the socialist calculation debate, that an all-wise central planner would order. An all-wise central planner would allow the Chinese and now the Vietnamese, before the Japanese, before that the Germans, to specialize in low-wage industries and export to us. A central planner would, under ideal socialism. So it's progress that they're objecting to, not neoliberalism. I mean, this is very clear in Hungary, where, Hungarian agriculture is not a good prospect for the future of Hungary. So despite enormous subsidies from the common market, it's not doing very well. So you get support for fascism, which is just another form of socialism. It's very depressing. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll stand so you can see me. My name is Claire Gunner. I'm 22, which places me between 16 and 26.
There's hope.
So please do influence me. My question is, do you think that the free market and socialism, and when I say socialism, I mean socialist ideas such as universal health care and free education, do you think they're mutually exclusive?
No, I don't think so. As Adam Smith said, I think that education, at least elementary education, should be subsidized by taxes on you and me. But of course, paying for it isn't the same thing as providing it. And as you know, there is just a deep confusion about this. People say, oh, well, but we've got to have elementary education. All right. And I'm willing to be taxed to provide it because I don't think poor people will do enough if it's not free. But I want it to be free. I want it to be free. The same thing holds in a more radical way for roads. Whenever you speak to a convinced statist, which is a more comprehensive term but certainly covers socialism, you say, well, look, we ought to have a smaller government. They say, well, what, don't you want roads? And they imagine a world in which suddenly all the roads disappear. And I say, yeah, I want roads, but I want them to be provided privately as they were in the United States and Britain in the 18th and early 19th century. Then, in a way that would make a very interesting dissertation in history, they became defined as public goods. I think it's a piece of municipal socialism. But in any case, now it's trivial for roads to be owned privately. You put a transponder in your vehicle, and you can pay for the roads the way you pay for your gas bill. But it's very hard to get people to change. In Ireland, there's a proposal, which sounds very reasonable even in such a wet place, to meter water. Okay? Meter water. This has become an immense political issue in Ireland, because the Irish say, to hell with that. I don't want my water metered. I want to run it 24 hours a day as long as I want. Go away. Well, you know, it's the ideological battle on points like this that we need to win. And won. Here's the cheerful news. We did win once. Henry David Thoreau. By the way, there's a sensationally good biography. I can't even remember her name, from the University of Chicago Press, called Henry David Thoreau. Read it. Skip the first chapter on the geology of Walden Pond. But he said, I fervently support the proposition that government is best that governs least. He was not a socialist. Yes, dear.
Hi, I'm Diane Katz with Heritage. I thought it was very interesting what you had to say about the nuclear family and its impact. I also wonder, though, is altruism innate? Do we have any, do we come with some altruism that over experience becomes tempered?
Well, we do. We humans, among the great apes, by actual careful experiment, humans are unusually cooperative. There have been many, many experiments showing this between chimpanzees, even bonobo chimpanzees, who are the nicest of the two, and gorillas. We cooperate all the time. I think it's entwined with language. But what we need to convince people of is that specialization and ownership of property and its outcome results in massive cooperation. I said I didn't quite finish my tale about buying my accordion, my little accordion, trying to learn it. I forgot to give you the punchline, which is that what? I bought this accordion from Czechoslovakia. And it's a beautiful instrument. I just wish I could play it. What? I'm supposed to make my own accordion? In fact, the logical reduction of protectionism of any sort is, all right, let's protect Illinois, erect tariff barriers. All right, Chicago. All right, Printers Row. All right, my own house, and then I'll have plenty of jobs. It's pazzo. So, yes, cooperation. Here's another version of that point. You'll always hear enterprises called, nonprofit enterprises are always identified as being nonprofit, as though there was something especially virtuous, a presumption of virtue, unless they're called the Heritage Foundation, if in nonprofit institutions. But come on, this system of markets is the most altruistic ever designed. People do work for each other incessantly. I get very annoyed what's become the current cant about admiring people for their military service. And they do it on MSNBC as much as on Fox News. Thank you for your service. What are you talking about? Someone who makes toothbrushes is doing you a service. Stop it. Sorry, I get all excited about this.
Is there a question over here?
Yeah, we don't want to
John.
Ignore the left.
Yes, John Burlaw, Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
You talk here about innovation, and in your writing you say what changed in like really in the 19th century and early 20th century with innovation was as much as the innovations and one phenomenon drove each other is the way society viewed the innovator and the inventor. Right. Instead of somebody as instead of as crackpots, all of a sudden they were visionaries.
Exactly.
They were the benefactors of society. I have my own thoughts about this, but what do you think was responsible for this? And is there hope in that, you could still get a progressive admiring Steve Jobs, they want to redistribute his wealth, but they still admire the invention, the technology, the innovator.
Yeah, well, the sort of characteristic figure of this is Benjamin Franklin, who held only one patent in his life, though he invented a whole bunch of things. And at age 43, having become the most successful printer in the colonies, he sold his business and became a public inventor and scientist and so on. Ben wanted to be a gentleman, very much in the 18th century sense. So he wanted to climb the existing hierarchy. But that's right. It's the change in attitude towards Benjamin Franklin's that matters. It's not. I see people who have only read the titles of my books, actually the title of the first of the trilogy, think that I mean that there was a change in that business people became more virtuous in the 18th century. Say, it's the same way they feel if they haven't read any of my books on the rhetoric of economics. They think I'm advocating more fancy language in economics. I'm saying that there is a change in social attitudes. Now, why, you ask? You evidently haven't read the third book of the trilogy, because that's where I answer it. And you must run down and get it. Thank you, dear. And it says the causes were accidents in Europe. Nothing deep about Europe. My argument is not, as so many of my conservative friends want to make it, a story of the deep superiority of people. I call them melanin-challenged people. It's not about the deep innovativeness of Europe, which wasn't. The most innovative society in the world in 1492 was China. It had the best ships, it had the best agriculture, the best science, the best mathematics, the best whatever you want to talk about, the best painting, China. No, it was the accidents of a whole bunch of accidents, not just one. The Protestant Reformation, the Dutch revolt against Spain, both of them reasonably successful. The English Civil War of the 1640s and its follow-on in the 1650s. The glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, the failed Dutch Revolution, and the French Revolution. All of these accidentally made ordinary people bold. Take Protestantism. What is important in Protestantism is not my Protestantism, which is Anglican, or the Lutherans, the so-called magisterial Reformation, which kept a hierarchy in the church. My priest is chosen by the bishop. But Congregationalism, whereas its name implies the congregation chooses the minister, or still more radically coming out of the 1640s in England, the Society of Friends, the Quakers, in which no one is the minister, and women are allowed to speak in the meeting. And one after another of these, the Dutch, the northern Dutch, so to speak, defeat the military hegemon of the 16th and early 17th centuries, Spain, Habsburgs. And this gives them the idea that they can have a go. And this having a go is crucial. Who's next?
This gentleman and then this young lady in the back.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rabinowitz. I'm retired. And I'd like to
I am too, thank God.
It's a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah, boy, I'm telling you, all of you ought to work on getting retired.
It's worth waiting for. But I'd like to get to your definition of socialism.
Yeah.
Because as I understand it, in capitalism, everything is owned by somebody.
Yeah.
And the extreme of capitalism is feudalism, where everything's owned by one person, the emperor, the tsar, whatever. And in capitalism, if you own a house, you step off your property, you're on somebody else's property who can then charge you to use it or
trespass.
Right. And as soon as you start having public highways, roads, and stuff like that, then you're socialist. So basically, the situation we live in right now is socialism.
I agree with you.
Where you have a mixture of public and private property.
I agree.
And when everything becomes public property or community property, that's communism.
Well, something like it.
Yeah.
Actually, in socialist theory, communism is the last stage.
Well,
it's when everything disappears.
Communism
the state disappears.
When everything is publicly owned.
Yeah.
Owned by the commune and in state communism, everything's owned by the state.
Yeah.
And if the state is controlled by one person, then it's not really communism, it's feudalism.
Yeah,
because one person owns everything. So the Soviet Union was not really communist, it was feudal.
Yeah, I agree.
Try to keep it to a question.
Yes, and my question...
Well, I don't actually agree with that analysis, although it has elements with which I agree.
That was what I was going to
ask.
Large
parts of it are wrong.
I think, by the way, what you were getting back about the accidents in Europe was basically the end of feudalism, where it wasn't all owned by one person.
That's wrong. That's
what I want to ask. What is your definition?
Here's the key point.
Correct me.
One of the many reasons I don't like the word capitalism is that people think it's a stage of history. That's, we're all Marxists now. And that's wrong. Ownership, property, markets are pervasive in human society and always have been. One of the earliest archaeological sites is the Blombos Cave in South Africa. And at the time, the Blombos Cave area where these people lived was 100 miles from the seashore. And yet they found, at 70,000 BCE, they found a necklace made of seashells. Now, they didn't get it by walking 100 miles and then walking 100 miles back. They must have been trading with, and it's dangerous in such circumstances to walk over to another hunter-gatherer's area. You're liable to get in trouble. No. that's one of the earliest, but there are many, many, many others, evidence of trade. So it's not true that exchange or property is new. Property is, in fact, characteristic of some species of butterflies who will take up a position in a sunny area of a forest and defend it against other butterflies. Property is commonplace in the animal world and even in the vegetable world. So this whole idea that there's something new about so-called capitalism is wrong. It's deeply mistaken. What is new is innovism. What's new in world making is the incredible amount of innovation. That's new. And that's what we that's what we need to explain, not this matter of the stages of history, which is wrong, mistaken.
We have time for one more question. This young lady in the back.
Hi there. Thank you for your time. My name is Cecilia, and I'm with the Institute for Humane Studies. And I have a question.
HS, yay!
So the economist Tyler Cowen and the political philosopher Jason Brennan have recently written about how extremely capitalistic places like California tend to overestimate or virtue signal even when they benefit a lot from the market. So they tend to vote towards more social policies.
Sure, they do.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and say like how, what effect that has, like very capitalistic, well-doing economies do in, I guess, overestimate.
Well, you know, all we can do, we can't take them out and shoot them. I wouldn't want to. We can't send them to Chinese government re-education camps, as the Chinese government is doing on a massive scale as we speak with the Uyghurs. So we can't do that, but all we can do is preach to them. And actually, probably better than academics like me preaching to them is popular culture. There's a great movie called Joy about Joy Mangano, the inventor of the self-squeezing mop. And it's a terrifically, basically pro-innovism tale. It's really about an innovation. There's about the same time, there was a very good movie called The Founder about Ray Kroc, who had failed in business over and over and over again, and then figured out that you could take the McDonald's brothers model of assembly line production of hamburgers. I mean, I was watching a hamburger guy this morning. I had to get breakfast at the train station, and it was wonderful to watch him. But of course, he couldn't do the volume that an assembly line can, and that was their discovery. Okay, look, more rock music with free market themes. I think country music, I'm not much of a country music fan. I like it, but I don't know much about it. I think country music is a really good place to look for pro-innovism, pro-market themes. Now, there's a lot of kind of whining. You know what happens when in a country music, when you run a country music tune backwards, the guy gets back his girl, his gun, and his pickup. But it's popular culture. That's where the rubber meets the road, to use a country music expression. That's where it is. And it always has been. Ideologies are formed in the high and low culture. They're not formed, look, Hollywood produces endless anti or pro-socialist movies. Actually, here's what's so absurd about it. Anti-corporatist movies produced by massive corporations with corporate officers hanging from the ceilings. It's ridiculous.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. If you'd like a copy of the outline, I'll leave it here. And just one final reminder, the next event in the series is November 15th. George Gilder speaking on capitalism as an information learning system. Thanks again.